reported that UFC 232 got around 700,000 pay-per-view buys. And when I heard this number, it sounded pretty good, but I wanted to run some numbers on it and get a rough idea of if I thought this was going to end up being good for the UFC or not in the long run. Obviously, they moved UFC 232 from Las Vegas to California because John Jones was unable to fight in Nevada, or at least they weren't sure that he would be able to, and they didn't want to take a risk with it. And in doing so, they incurred a lot of costs. So based off of what Dana White was saying, he said that he figured the UFC would lose about $6 million in the cost between taxes, between the cost of moving the event. And so for this to make sense for them, at least in the short term, you would figure that the amount of money that they would make by having John Jones on the top of a card in California would make up for much more than $6 million compared to if they would have taken John Jones off and had Cyborg versus Nunes be the main event. So what I did is I put together a spreadsheet looking at events that, at least with, I guess John Jones hasn't fought in a while, so looking at Nunes and Cyborg's pay-per-views, looking at what they sold, looking at what John Jones versus Gustafsson sold, and trying to decide how much more money they made by making sure they had Jones on top of the card, or at least this would be how they'd probably try to look at it. So if you look at the last fights for Nunes headlined UFC 224 against Raquel Pennington, and that only had 85,000 pay-per-view buys. Cyborg's last one before that was against Yana Kunitskaya with 260,000 buys. Cyborg also had a very good event. This was probably the most similar one you can compare it to, given that it's pretty much the same exact time of year. This was on December 30th of 2017, whereas the UFC 232 was December 29th December 29th of 2018. So if you're going to give a fair estimate to what this probably would have been had they decided to stay in Vegas and take John Jones off the card, you're probably looking at around 380,000 buys. That's what it was last year. So just for comparison's sake, we'll put that in the spreadsheet. And what that would mean is that the revenue difference between having 700,000 buys versus having 380,000 buys would be $20,796,000. And the way that I factored this would be taking $64.99 per pay-per-view buy, which is what the UFC charges. I think they charge a little bit less for standard definition, but there's really no way for me to estimate how many standard definition buys there were versus high definition buys. So I'm going with all HD buys here. And then I also have a line beyond that, which is revenue difference minus cost. So that includes the $6 million that Dana White had referenced in the previous article. So what that would leave them with is about $14.8 million in a difference between what they would have made had they, or what they did make in addition because they moved over to California versus what they would have made had they stayed in Las Vegas. So at least from the pay-per-view standpoint, that looks pretty good. Now, granted, it's worth noting that there's some other marginal costs that I wasn't able to factor in here. So that would include pay-per-view points for champs. Obviously, that would be John Jones, Amanda Nunes, and Cyborg. All of them get a percentage of how many pay-per-views they sell. So by selling more, they got a larger percentage. So that would kind of cut away at the $14.8 million. Also, if you look at the share with the cable providers take a pretty hefty amount of that $64.99. Although with the UFC doing some streaming where they have the UFC.tv, in a lot of cases, they're able to reduce that number by quite a bit. So it's hard to tell what percentage that ends up being when you factor in not just like a DirecTV buy or an AT&T buy, but also the UFC.tv buys through Fight Pass. So those would cut into the $14.8 million too. But I think even after you take that out, it looks like in the short term, the UFC made the right decision by moving and keeping John Jones on the top of the card. The question that I have next, though, is that when they did make the decision to move, what they did to the fans, I felt was not very... I'd say it would be pretty unfair. So for a lot of the fans who would decide to fly out to Vegas, decide to get hotel rooms, for them to get a week's notice and have them say, hey, look, we're only going to give you back the money for the ticket, that's really not enough in my opinion. I think if you look at the different types of fans who attend an event, you look at hardcore fans. Hardcore fans are the fans who are going to be the most likely to repeat purchase. If you look at all of these pay-per-views, at the low numbers, like for example, the Nunes versus Pennington, this is primarily hardcore fans that are going to be buying this. The more hardcore fans you have, the more repeat purchases you're going to get. This kind of factors into a business concept called churn, or CRM, customer relationship management, where if you run a business, it's in your best interest once you actually acquire a customer to get them to keep purchasing, get them to keep repurchasing. And in that way, it's a lot cheaper than having to acquire a bunch of different customers. So an idea to think about it is if you own a coffee shop, it's a lot easier to get 10 people who are going to buy 10 cups of coffee than it is to get 100 separate people to buy their first cup of coffee. So it's important that once you actually have a customer that you keep them coming back for more. So by kind of screwing over the fans here, for the hardcore fans who were attending it, you're potentially risking them either kind of sliding into more like a casual fan where maybe they still like the UFC, so they're not going to completely give it up, but they're kind of pissed off, so maybe they're not going to be as willing to spend money. And then the ones who are like, "Fuck it, this is too much. I'm doing the UFC." Then you're losing a really important customer there. For the casual fans who would go there, those might be people who just want to go to the big fights or who are going to be in Vegas anyway and wanted to stop by. You're giving them a bad experience by taking away the fight card from them and only giving them money back for the ticket. So again, there you're potentially losing them. And really, when you have the casual fan who goes to a UFC event, that's really a big opportunity for you to convert them into a hardcore fan and be able to get more repeat purchases out of them. So by fucking up that experience for them, I think they really screwed up there. And then obviously you have the non-fans too. So I guess an example of a non-fan who would go to an event would be like if you have a girlfriend or a wife who really doesn't like the UFC but knows you really do. So she buys tickets for the two of you to go. And when she goes there, she actually is experiencing the UFC. So there's a chance there that she might actually enjoy it and then kind of move into the casual fan or maybe even move straight to hardcore depending on how much she enjoys it. So by screwing her over again, you're getting rid of an opportunity to gain a new fan. So either way, I think where the UFC is at now, the fact that they did make what looks to be a pretty significant amount of money, I think what would be in their best interest is to see if there's any way they can try to win back some of the fans they pissed off. Whether they say, hey, look, if you can send us receipts of travel arrangements, whether it's cancellations or whether it's a new arrangement to like drive out, whether it's like gas to drive out to Inglewood from Vegas, whether it's airfare to fly out, if they can kind of help fans cover some of the costs that were associated from having to move from Las Vegas to Inglewood, I think it'd be a really good sign just to those fans. It would probably help that out a lot. But also, there are a lot of fans who weren't directly affected. For example, I wasn't directly affected. I didn't have a ticket to UFC 232, but I was pretty disgusted by what I saw. I didn't like how they treated the customers there. And so the next time the UFC comes to my town, I may or may not be as willing to go. So if you can kind of show that you understand that what happened there, it was rare. It's not something that you want to see happen again. It's something that you feel bad about and you want to make sure you make it right. Not only are you going to help out a lot with the fans who actually got screwed over there, but you're really going to send a message to fans who are watching from the outside that you actually do care about the fans. You don't want to screw them over. And when it does happen, you want to make sure that you make it right in the end. So hopefully the extra money they made on this card by keeping John Jones on the top and moving to California, some of that can be used to kind of make it right with the fans and make sure that they keep coming back and want to keep coming back at that.